So let's talk about asymmetrical gameplay. Yes, asymmetrical gameplay is one of those things that are part of some games. It's not necessarily something you see very often. However, it is something that I would love to see in a game like Stellaris, and apparently I'm not the only one. The developers as well as various people within the company have talked about this concept. Now, first of all, we're going to need to illustrate what asymmetrical gameplay actually is and how it ties into Stellaris and what kind of asymmetrical gameplay is already available. So, asymmetrical gameplay, what is it? In asymmetrical gameplay, you play in a game environment where you are not necessarily playing the same game as somebody else. A good example of this would be Evolve. Evolve is a game where you are either a group of hunters who are trying to take down a gigantic monster, or you are playing as a gigantic monster who is trying to take down the four hunters. There's a little bit of overlap between the goals and the objectives that both sides have, but the way of getting there is vastly different, and that is what asymmetrical gameplay is. Now, how does this tie into Stellaris? Well, for instance, let's take a look at what has been added in Stellaris, or what is the base game, really. The base game of Stellaris is very simple. We have our standard gameplay loop. Now, I've got this diagram here. It is incredibly simplified, but we're just going to use this to illustrate my point. It may not be 100% accurate, but you will get the general idea. You start off with a planet. Fair enough, then you grow and develop that planet by using pops. Pops are the core resource within the game. They are what is basically the core of your economy. It's what everything stems from. Every resource flows from your pops. Therefore, they are your primary resource. And then, of course, you improve your world by getting more resources, such as minerals and food, and you turn them into consumer goods, into alloys, and then you specialize your world and trying to get more resources that way. Then you expand to a new planet, and you continue the cycle. And all the way around, pops are important in that process. Now, how is this actually differentiated within Stellaris? What is an example of asymmetrical gameplay within the game? Overall, there are a couple that could be considered asymmetrical, even though I don't necessarily think it goes far enough. Of course, you have your standard empire. In this particular case, you have your totalitarian regime. They are dictatorial. They've got Diplocore. They are a variant of the standard type of empire. They don't necessarily do anything special in the grand scheme of things. However, if you go to, say, a robot empire, they play slightly differently, but not to the point where they are in fact asymmetrical. A robot empire does not inherently play differently from a standard empire. Sure, they may not use consumer goods, they may not have trade value, but they don't do anything unique in extension of that. Sure, they've got a couple of minor things that kind of sort of make things asymmetrical, such as no longer growing pops. They built them instead, but that is not deep enough. Then, of course, you have your joy of the wonders of the hive mind. Now, hive minds are an interesting case. Hive minds are very similar to robots to the point where they are basically robots in terms of their setup, except they are biological. So we've got our hive mind, and basically you can grow your pops and use them in different ways. And again, you don't use any consumer goods, or you don't have any trade value there, which basically makes them easier to play. But again, they are not asymmetrical. The only real thing within Stellaris that could be potentially considered to be asymmetrical are the megacorps. Why the megacorps? Well, the megacorps themselves have unique mechanics that are behind them. They can use specialized little menus and specialized buildings to build on other planets, and they have similar objectives as everybody else, but they have very different ways of getting to them, and that's mainly through trade value. Other empires don't necessarily do all of that stuff, and that right there is something you want to keep in mind. Now, how do we make Stellaris asymmetrical. Well, we'll go back to our gameplay loop. Once again, it is incredibly simplified here. How can you change an element of this core gameplay loop in such a way that the gameplay becomes asymmetrical? Let's start off with the very first one, planets. How can you change the setup here that you don't have planets? Well, a good example here would be playing as a megacorp once again, but it's more of a on the move sort of scenario. You are a fleet that moves from location to location. It's something that people have been requesting for quite some time, and it is also something that the developers have been thinking of. But the real question is, does it fit within the general framework of the game?
That's like seeing more types of asymmetrical play with a relatively unexplored topic for us at PDS, and I think there's definitely a lot of room to grow there. Because like ideally, right, we have all these fantasies that we would love to be able to play out in the game, but because of how it's constructed, it's not really feasible, right? Like it would be super cool if like you had like this, the galaxy felt like vast and it felt like it was full of life, and you could, for example, play like a civilization a little bit like an enclave, right? You just have this one station and all you do is like trade with people. And like it would be amazing if the game could facilitate those types of gameplay experiences, if we use that term rather than like playstyles. There is probably a better term that I should try to figure out what it is, but gameplay experiences or like that could incorporate asymmetrical play as well.
And that, of course, is an interesting example. You know, the development team has thought about these sort of things, but the real question is it worthwhile implementing? Because you're effectively generating a whole new sub-game within the game. Is this realistic? Well, we can move on to something else, for instance. In the gameplay loop, we've got pops. And as I mentioned, pops are your core resources. Applying pops to the thing that you want to apply them to, whether or not it's your economy or something else, a particular resource, a certain specialization, makes them a resource because you need to spend your pops on a certain thing to make proper use of them in order to get to your objectives. That is the core illustration of a resource. The whole thing about minerals, food, energy, they are just secondary examples of what comes from that initial resource generation. And of course, the whole Unity influence, consumer goods and alloys and everything that comes from that is an extension of that secondary resource system. But what if pops themselves are different? How would they work? Now, I talked to Daniel Moregård about this particular example, and he came up with a very interesting example on his side that we may see in the future, which I think could be really, really interesting.
Both a hive mind plays different from a megacorp or plays very different from a robot. You know, parentheses, what if robots didn't even have pops, for example? There's so many like cool things there that like just making them play different mechanically, but then also supporting asymmetric play as a even more level of complexity. That would be super cool if we could pull that off sometime in the future. Let's take like the practical example of like, let's just throw out the crazy idea, like, you know, what if machine empires didn't have pops? Like if we use that as our starting like sort of experiment thought, right? What would we need to change in the current way the game works to facilitate, right? That's probably a lot harder to achieve rather than like having that in mind versus like starting a game from scratch, for example, right?
But yeah, robot empires that do not have pops are a fascinating idea because robot empires really apply the resources in a completely different way, at least on paper. Using robots doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense within the grand scheme of things. They could be using computerized systems instead and trying to get resources in different ways and in a more optimized sort of way, which I think is a really interesting idea. But you could even extend this to more different scenarios. For instance, how do you grow and develop a colony? Do you even grow and develop a colony, or do you improve a colony? You could do so. There is a couple of types of empires of the game. Well, I say a couple. It's actually just the one. It is, of course, the Ravenous Hive of the lithoid variety, the calamitous birth combination that we can get here in combination with some of our other things. The Terravores are probably one of the more unique gameplay mechanics that are within the game, because they are, to an extent, truly asymmetric. They do not function like other empires. They go to other worlds, consume them, and then bring those resources back towards their core worlds. And that is a really, really strong example of asymmetry within Stellaris. And I do hope that we're going to see more of this kind of stuff in the future. But the real problem is that the framework of Stellaris does not allow for a lot of flexibility for these sort of things, because the game has not initially been designed to work with asymmetrical gameplay. If we look all the way back to the 1.0 version of the game, you will see that it's very much set up to work within a framework of having nations that have different ethics and different ideas, and then they clash. When it comes to more exotic forms of government, like the ones that I've already talked about, such as the robots, do they need pops, terravores, but also maybe a mobile fleet. That was not originally part of the scope of the game. So the real question is whether or not the code base for Stellaris allows for these sort of mechanics. Terravores are kind of hacked together within the script files, at least as far as I understand, to make these sort of things happen. But I still think they are a fascinating way of dealing with things. Sure, they still need those amenities. They don't need consumer goods, though. They do not need alloys. But when we're seeing new updates coming in from the Custodians team, and specifically on the Plantoid side, where we may be seeing empires building quite a lot of stuff with maybe food, because they are plantoids in fact, or they use energy, who knows, biosynthesis may be a thing, who knows. It's something that really makes the mind wonder. And I think there's a couple of mods out there that really touch on this subject. And one of the big examples of this one is Forgotten Hive Minds, or specifically Forgotten Hive Queens. I think hives have quite a lot of potential to play as true asymmetrical empires. And it also means that certain resources could be more useful to certain empires, such as food or minerals. Lithoids kind of play in that general direction, but in a very light sort of way. And I really wonder how this is going to work within the grand scheme of things. If you're interested in seeing more asymmetrical gameplay, empires that play in truly alien ways, in ways that you have never thought of before, or at least play completely differently from what we have in the base game right now, feel free to leave a comment below, because I'm really interested in your feedback. Now, at this point in time, I'm not really looking forward to anything like, oh yeah, the asymmetry from the FTL systems that were in the game all the way up to 2.0. Yes, I've heard your argument many times. There was a good reason why it was changed. It's not something that we should harp on for too much, because whilst it was a difficult choice to make, I do think it was the right one to steer the game into the right direction, mostly from a balance point of view, because it was very difficult to work with, and I don't think that we're going to be seeing any FTL changes anytime in the future. But yeah, if you have any other ideas, feel free to list them down below. I'm really curious about what you guys are thinking when it comes to asymmetrical gameplay potential within Stellaris, and maybe even on how it would work. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you to my patrons for making this video possible, and of course also Daniel Moregård for joining me for the interview that I had with him a little while back to talk about this particular subject. I'm gonna go and wrap this one up here. Thank you so much for watching. It's been a real pleasure as always, and until next time, take good care of yourselves and, as always, each other.